when did your consciousness of the role of the director, where did that begin to take shape for you?
Wow, I have to say that I didn't, like many people who enjoy films, watch films, I think that they have a sense for, the performers that are in the film, less of a sense for the director, and then even less of a sense for who writes the film. But, I have to say it was when I was quite young and I was starting to watch a number of films by the same director and got a sense that there was something different going on, and that would have to be with Robert Altman. And I was a young kid when I first saw MASH. And MASH was not like any of the other films I had seen. And I thought, and I wondered why. And then I saw, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and I thought, what's the common thread between these two films? And I realized it was this director named Robert Altman.
And absolutely, he was one of the most unique voices in cinema. He had a style all of his own that was unmistakable. And I'm sorry. I must have been about 11 years old when I saw MASH, and I had seen it close to The Exorcist, and it really didn't strike me with The Exorcist, who made this thing, but with MASH, I definitely wondered who made this thing, because it was unlike anything I'd seen. Yeah. Well, that brings about an interesting question, and you discuss it some in your book, but how does a wannabe director, how do they find their voice? I mean, what do they have to know about themselves before they can be a successful director?
Well, I think one of the things, I think that you need to watch a lot of films. And I think that by watching a lot of films, you find yourself drawn towards certain kinds of approaches, certain kinds of stories. And then you have to, I just think you have to be very aware of your own creative sensibility, your background, and not the stories necessarily that you want to tell, but the stories that you have in you to tell. I have my students, I'm a professor at Hunter College, and I teach mostly screenwriting, but I do have my students create scenes from things that they see around them in their everyday life, whether it's a family thing or something they observe at work or something they observe on the street. And they do this like every week or every 2 weeks. And what that does is it gets them aware that drama stories are all around them. And if they start looking at their own lives and what's around them, it's where they start to begin to discover where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. It segues into something that I'm always curious about when I speak with screenwriters or filmmakers, how important life experience is.
Jamie, I have to say I've been a teacher for now 20 years, and beyond that, I've judged so many festivals and read so many screenplays. And one of the things where beginners, where novices sort of where they don't succeed is when they think that they have to make things up. To a certain extent, you're not really making anything up. You're taking everything that you know about human behavior and human interactions and what people do when they try to control a situation. You're just taking all the things that you already know and you're transplanting them into a kind of a fictional context. Mm-hmm. But the raw material is the things that you know from what's around you. Flannery O'Connor said everybody who's lived to the age of 21 has enough material to be a fiction writer for the rest of their lives.
That's interesting. But you talk about the importance of schooling yourself in film and watching as many as you possibly can, and that's certainly important. But it must be a process as well of taking in what you can apply personally, what fits you, and not merely carbon copying what you've seen before. So I would think to accomplish that, you would need
practice, and
Yes.
that means that the short film form is probably a perfect starting ground for filmmakers, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing, to respond to the first part of that question, it's true. Only Martin Scorsese can make a Scorsese film.
Yeah.
And only Kelly Reichardt can make a Kelly Reichardt film.
Mm-hmm.
Only Todd Haynes can make a Todd Haynes film. These three people have very unique voices, and they've found what it is that they contribute, and that's really the task of, it's not just filmmakers, any creative artist. That's really their major task. But yes, getting your hands on any kind of equipment and getting out there and making things and practicing and interacting with the crew and seeing what develops as you make films is very, very important. And the short form, and I mean, I have to say, students these days, or young filmmakers these days, is very lucky because you can make really beautiful stuff with very little money.
Absolutely. And what always fascinated me as well was the idea of screenwriting as opposed to directing, because screenwriting seems like such a solitary endeavor.
Yeah.
And directing is all about collaboration.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to be of two minds to be good at both, or do you?
Well, I actually think that when you are a screenwriter, if you're a screenwriter, you have to be thinking collaboratively while you're writing. Though you are all alone, you have to trust the process of filmmaking, where you have a team of talented people, talented creative people who are expert at their positions, and they're going to bring something to the script, and they're going to hopefully make that better. And you have to sort of, as a screenwriter, trust that process. So, you don't put in camera angles. You don't have to describe exactly how every scene is lit. You don't have to describe every article of clothing. You don't have to describe every, set design, because you know that these people are going to pick up on what, the tone and the ideas behind your story, and they're going to run with it. So you, in a way, are collaborating by not getting in people's way. But that said, the task of a director is a little bit different, because the director has to find these ideas behind everything that's in the script, and then communicate those ideas or their particular perspective on the script to the rest of the crew. So theirs is a very active collaboration.
How important is it, because you go into great depth about camera and the other kind of technical aspects of filmmaking, how important is it for the director to know everything that he can about the other positions on the film crew?
Yeah, this is a big question, because boy, it's not just that there's so much technology, but the technology is changing so quickly.
Yeah.
But still, even at that, in some ways, the technology is the easier side of things, and so sometimes the director can distract themselves with the technology from the harder things, which is the communicating with the actors and finding those thematic and subtextual kernels in the script. That said, if you're lucky enough to have a crew, I mean, it depends. Every project is slightly different, and it depends how large your crew is and how expert your crew is. But ideally, the crew is there to protect the director from having to worry about a lot of the technology, so that they can do the stuff that directors do, which is consider what is in front of that camera, what is going down on the film, how the performances are, and what environments these performances are taking place in, what it looks like. But there's a certain, and this is one of the things that we do in directing. We talk a lot about the technology, and we try and zero in on what is the technology that is essential for a director to know. In other words, what is the technology that is part of the interpretive palette of a director? So a director has to know lenses. A director has to know. A director maybe doesn't need to know how to need to know what back focus is on a lens, but they do need to know the difference between a close-up with a wide-angle lens and a close-up with a telephoto lens, because that's something that has an impact on the way the shot feels.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So lenses, sound design. We go through in the book the technology that we think a director really should know if they're going to be eloquent in cinema.
Well, I would think he or she would need to know enough to be able to speak a certain language to the other people on the crew. And one of the great sections of your book, which I was glad to see present there, talks about the moving camera and making sure that when you do have movement in your film, that it's motivated.
Yeah.
And so which would be a conversation you would have with your DP.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have a conversation with the DP, and you need to. It's exactly right. That what you said, that you need to also know enough technology that you can communicate clearly with your crew, and so that the crew, in some ways, doesn't sort of go off with their own ideas. But the metaphor that we use in the book is that a director is similar to a conductor of an orchestra. The conductor doesn't have to be a virtuoso on every instrument that's in the orchestra, but they do need to know enough about every instrument to know what its creative capacity is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Tell me, because this is the 5th edition of Directing Film Techniques and Aesthetics, what's new about this edition?
Well, I'm new to this edition. The first 4 editions were written by Michael Rebiger, and they were incredibly well adopted. People, they sold well, and people really liked the books. And I was brought in here in the 5th edition. After 4 editions, the book was a little bit gangly. It was getting big. It was getting a little rangy. So I was brought in to sort of reorganize the book to make sure it was holding together. And it's been an incredible collaboration with Michael, I have to say. We've both had a great time doing this. But so some of the things that are new is that there's some expansion of the section on dramatic basics and script analysis and how a director approaches a script. There is a lot of new material on the director's screen grammar, basically, the meaning of shot sizes, of editing approaches, like you say, the moving camera, that's new. So the tools and the vocabulary of cinema. I think we have a little bit more in the pre-production area in terms of specifically how the director collaborates with the crew, why and how they collaborate with the cinematographer and the art director and the location sound mixer. We have a lot more stuff on lighting and the impact of lighting, and also we talk about, more. There's a new discussion on everything from naturalistic approaches to stylized approaches, and coming to terms with how you're going to present the story in pre-production.
I want to ask you about the naturalism versus stylistic approach. But before this question leaves my mind, you made me think of something in your answer just now. When you're writing about the artistic process or teaching about the artistic process, is that a challenge? Are there some sections that remain kind of elusive, that are hard to articulate?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I mean, what can you teach about art? It reminds me of a great quote by Alexander McKendrick, whose book on directing is also a great book. He said, Alexander McKendrick, who did Sweet Smell of Success, the director. He said film, and he was a great teacher himself at Cal Arts. And he said film writing and directing cannot be taught, only learned. And each man or woman has to learn it through their own system of self-education. So I like this idea that it can't be taught, but it can be learned.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a certain extent that we can do. We do what we can in the book. It's sort of a guide. It sets things up. It communicates to a student or a young filmmaker, the language of cinema and the way the process works and the way we collaborate. But ultimately, there is that spark that is up to the artist, and they have to find it.
Yeah. And in terms of the approach that a director chooses to take on his film, whether it be a naturalistic approach or one that's overly or highly stylized, that must be a tricky process to figure out which approach can bring out the most in your themes and your subtext.
Yeah, sure. The first thing is that, we talk about naturalism, this sort of cinema realism, which is a kind of a hyperbolic realism, and highly stylized. And these are not points on a scale. This is a sliding scale. You can find your film anywhere along this continuum. But, this is part of what we were talking about earlier, the specific sensibility of the director, which is why a director needs to know themselves and what kind of stories they like to tell and how they like to tell those stories. Because you can give the same screenplay to three different directors. You can give the same screenplay to, Woody Allen, David Lynch, and the Coen brothers, and you're going to get three totally different movies, And it's because it's their approach. It's their, what do I want to say? It's the perspective of that unique storyteller.
Yeah, and I've always been curious. It's funny that you mentioned that you can give it to three different directors and come up with three different movies. That's always been a potential experiment that's fascinated me. I've always wanted different directors to take the same script and see, and it was kind of like what Gus Van Sant did years ago with Psycho. Obviously not a successful movie, but I was terribly fascinated because he went shot for shot. He even timed the shots to Hitchcock's specifications, and yet it was clearly different. There was something, like I said before, something elusive that Hitchcock had that Gus Van Sant couldn't bring to it because they're two different sensibilities. It was fascinating to me.
That would be a great omnibus film, is to have one script and three or four different directors do that script. I've never seen that.
Oh, yeah, that would be so terrific.
The only moment I remember is, do you know the documentary Tokyo Ga, which was done by Wim Wenders?
No.
And he goes to Japan in search of Yasujiro Ozu's Japan. He's a great fan of Ozu's films. And Wenders goes to a little alleyway where Ozu took a shot, did a shot in one of his films, and he says, "This is how I would shoot this alleyway." And then he says, "This is how Ozu shot the alleyway." And it's incredible. Comparison.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. So when you teach your students, what kinds of filmmakers or stories inspire them? What are the youth turned on by nowadays with cinema?
Well, that's a good question. If you look through the book, you see that we use a wide variety of films to illustrate concepts. So there are the films that the students are watching and are into these days. What's fun? Fight Club is one of those perennial films that seems to now have gone through a number of generations. And just as the Memento is a big film, Christopher Nolan in general is a big director that they like. there is less there's less overt interest in someone like Alexander Payne, but once they see the films, they love his films.
Mm-hmm.
I think that David O. Russell, like The Fighter, is a big film, fairly recent film. The Social Network, David Fincher films are all big with students these days, as are Soderbergh films.
Mm.
But then, the classics for them are Fight Club, Silence of the Lambs, of course. But what's fun about what I try to do in my classes, and it's exactly what I do in the book, is I try and introduce students to films that they don't know, but I know for a fact it will blow them away.
Right.
Like The Graduate. I just showed The Graduate in my class. And only 2 people in the class had seen The Graduate. And I thought, you're going to really like this film. I just know you're going to like it.
And it also lets them find out where the films they love come from.
Exactly.
There's a whole grammar, there's a whole history there. All of these come from something, and it gives you a sharper sense of these directors like Nolan and Soderbergh, where their sensibilities came from.
That's exactly right. So 500 Days of Summer is right now a very big film with my students, but not many have seen this great film. I don't know if you're familiar with it, called Submarine.
No.
By Richard Ayoade. It's a fabulous movie, and they love this film, and it gets them looking into the smaller films, and the smaller films are important for them to watch because these are the films that have stuff that can inspire them and stuff that they can learn from on their own filmmaking skill. I loved Iron Man, but Iron Man isn't going to help a student in film production 1.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But an Alexander Payne film would.
Yeah.
Something of that ilk. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. Election is such a sharply directed film. Every shot is so precise that it's it's just like a little masterclass.
Well,
I also think that Jason Reitman is a big filmmaker with people right now, with like Up in the Air, young adult.
I think so too. Yeah, and these guys really do have a sense of history and a sense of what inspires them. And I remember reading about Steven Soderbergh, and he has very particular influences. And he was sitting at a Sundance lab when he was first starting, and they were talking about their inspirations. And he said, "Why hasn't anyone mentioned Sidney Pollack?" Pollack was a filmmaker that had really inspired Soderbergh. And then I started watching Pollack movies, and I thought, I can completely comprehend that, where that inspiration. Yeah, it's fascinating.
And this whole new movement of America, these young people who are doing these neo-realist films like Raman Barani and
yes.
Kelly Reichardt and things, and clearly they're watching a lot of Italian neorealism. They're watching people like the Dardenne brothers. This idea of the neo-realist, this naturalistic film, it doesn't go away. It's always there, and you can just see the influences throughout film history.
Well, speaking of a master class, your book is a master class, and
great.
I really enjoyed reading it, and I'm going to enjoy touting it to all of our listeners.
Great. Thanks so much.
I appreciate it very much. I'll get you the link to the interview.
It's over already? I could talk to you a lot longer than this.
Yeah, it's been like 26 minutes. Are you okay? Is this
yeah,
okay?
I'm fine. Listen, one thing I did want to say is that in my previous book, which is called Voice and Vision, it's a much more technical book, but I do actually quote one of your interviews in the book, and I attribute the Movie Geeks United in there.
Are you kidding me?
No, not at all.
Why wasn't I aware of this? That's terrific. That's very flattering.
Yeah, I think it was an interview you did with Maurice Alberti, which was a very nice interview.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, because in that book, I talk a lot about the wrestler and her particular visual approach. You know, her and Aronofsky. By the way, Aronofsky is another huge director with young people these days. Anyway, about her. I mean, I talk about her and Aronofsky's collaboration and visual approach, and I think in that interview, you asked her about this notion of naturalism. What is naturalism? She gave a great quote, and I used it in that book.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Thank you. You know, and that is a fascinating thing because I can absolutely see where, because she's done some kind of high-profile documentary work, and I can see where she would apply that to her narratives. Do you try to emphasize documentary as well when you teach?
I don't. It's like I said, you know, when I'm talking about how dramatic narrative comes from the things that are around you, that you're familiar with, and I do sort of show some documentary scenes that play out almost identically to very carefully scripted narrative scenes. I know that Michael Rebiger has written another wonderful book on called Directing the Documentary, which is just sort of the seminal work on documentary production. So he has a very strong, he sees a very strong connection. To me, I really think it depends on the style of the film that you're making, and certainly, I mean, it's interesting how Aronofsky, you know, did not work with his usual cinematographer, but called upon Maurice Alberti, who did amazing work in Crumb, you know, the documentary, to actually shoot that film, and it's, you know, the documentary style works. I think it's one of his best films.
I do too, and it's one that is, like you said before, it is naturalistic and not heavily stylized. I mean, it's not the De Palma kind of theatrics of Black Swan or something similar to that. Yeah,
I mean, it's hard to think. It's hard to believe that it's the same director who made Requiem for a Dream.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's incredible. Well, I thank you so much for quoting our interview. I'm going to go pick up that book now.
Okay. Yeah, it's my other book. Be careful when you pick it up, because it is. If you think this is a big book, that's a huge book.
Is there another kind of topic of filmmaking that you would be anxious to explore and write about?
Well, I'm actually writing on a third. I'm writing a third book now for the British Film Institute Publishing, and what this book is, it's a film analysis book that is intended for filmmakers. So it's a practical way that we look at and analyze films so that we can understand technique. Because one of my pet peeves that have to do at film education is that, you know, film studies and film production are very separate from one another. And I think that, you know, people who do film theory can learn a lot if they know a little bit about how films are actually made and what actually happens on a set and how much luck is involved. And you know, how the chemistry that actually happens. And by the same token, I do think that filmmakers can benefit from understanding how to look and do deep sort of formal analysis of films, and it will help really sort of build their toolbox of techniques. You know, they don't have to reinvent the wheel if they can do this. And a lot of young film students, film production students, anytime you mention analysis, they think it's not related to production, and it is absolutely related to production. You know, you talk to any director, and they say, "Oh yeah, of course, that's just homework. That's just what you do for homework." You know, I was talking with Rana Barani, who's a young director, and he did this film Goodbye Solo. And much of it takes place in a taxi cab. And he said he watched every film he could get his hands on that had extended driving scenes, so he could figure out how do you cover, a long scene in a car.
I remember talking to him about Goodbye Solo when that was on the festival circuit, and he is amazing. He is amazing. So, in this book, are you taking? I'm sure you're using examples of certain films and how to analyze them to get a better understanding of how it applies to production.
Yeah, exactly.
So basically, what this book is going to do once I'm finished with it is that we look at each sort of craft area, cinematography, set design, location scouting, sound design, things like this. And first what I do is I kind of define what it is and who are the people who are responsible and what the collaboration is like. And then we analyze 3 films, one that takes a fairly traditional approach, one that pushes the envelope a little bit, and then one that's just out there radical. Just to give a sense for what the range of and the flexibility of that particular craft area is in telling stories.
Yeah. I find that when I'm looking at a film, and it's amazing how many people don't do this. I've discovered. I'm always kind of concerned with the first most basic question, which I think that a writer needs to ask himself, or a director, anyone. What is this movie about? I mean, there's what the movie is about, and then what it's really about. And
right.
Sometimes I see movies where I honestly don't think the filmmaker has asked that of themselves.
No, you're absolutely right. And there is what it's about on the plot level, and then there is what is it really about on the human level. You're right. You're absolutely right. And then there's another story which often gets lost in the shuffle, is then how am I going to tell this story so that the audience connects with what it's really about? Mm-hmm. Because whenever you write a screenplay or direct a film, you can't lose sight of the fact that you're communicating to an audience that doesn't know what's going on, and you have to bring them into the film. So you're not making the film in a vacuum. You're making it in order to, there's a relationship. There's an audience-film relationship, and you can never forget that particular relationship. But you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and also a challenge not to hit it too much on the nose, or the meaning is kind of superfluous after a while. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And if you hit it on the nose, then the audience has nothing to watch.
Nothing else. Yeah, absolutely.
But
yeah.
This is one of the things that is very unique about directing, and it doesn't come from me. It comes from Michael's earlier editions, and I really liked it very much about this book. If he never loses sight of the fact that when you're directing, you're working from a human vantage. The human vantage is yours. The human vantage is also the vantage of the audience watching. And the way we learn anything in life is the same way we're going to learn something in film. We know somebody's a mean person not because somebody tells us this is a mean person, but because we see them do mean things. Mm-hmm. So really, what a film is it's putting human behavior on display so that the audience says, wow, this is a mean guy, this is a nice person, this is an unjust situation. And that's the core of the core of audience engagement. Let them see from what they're witnessing, let them determine themselves what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And show more and tell less, I guess.
Absolutely.